In 40 years as a Texas Ranger, I'd seen plenty of strange things, but nothing prepared me for what we found on that scorching July morning at Whisper Creek Ranch. The radio call came in at 6:42 a.m. Possible livestock in distress, large predator involved. 20 minutes later, I pulled my truck to a stop and felt my blood run cold. There, 50 yards from the fence line, Jack Harmon's prize Brahman bull, Goliath, a magnificent beast worth more than my yearly salary, lay trapped beneath the crushing coils of the largest python I'd ever seen. The snake's body wrapped around the bull's torso again and again, each coil tightening like a living vice. "That bull's got 20 minutes at most," I told Jack, who'd arrived seconds after me. But what left us speechless wasn't just the attack, it was what Goliath did next. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The sun beat down mercilessly on Whisper Creek Ranch, the kind of Texas heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of your bones. 5 months without decent rain had left the land parched and desperate. Jack Harmon had been up since before dawn, checking water troughs and counting heads, a daily ritual that had become more urgent with each passing rainless day. Jack was a weathered man of 68, his skin tanned and creased from decades under the Texas sun. Since losing Sarah 3 years ago, the ranch and its animals had become his entire world, especially Goliath. When the massive Brahman bull didn't appear for his morning feed, Jack felt a stab of worry. "Goliath!" he called out, his voice carrying across the dusty pasture. The other cattle raised their heads briefly before returning to their listless grazing, but there was no sign of the distinctive white bull with the scar across his right flank. Jack climbed into his pickup, dust billowing behind him as he drove the perimeter fence line. It wasn't like Goliath to wander. That bull had a routine as reliable as a Swiss watch, a trait Sarah had always found amusing. "That bull's got more sense than most people I know," she used to say. The tracks led him to the eastern edge of the property, near the old oak that Sarah had loved so much. And that's when he saw it, a sight that nearly stopped his heart. Goliath was down, his massive frame shuddering beneath the coils of a snake so large it seemed impossible. By the time I arrived, Jack was standing frozen at the fence line, his knuckles white around a rifle he couldn't bring himself to fire. "I might hit Goliath," he explained, his voice barely steady. I radioed for backup immediately. "This is Ranger Webb. I've got a Burmese python, at least 20 feet long, attacking livestock at Whisper Creek Ranch. Need assistance and wildlife management, code 3. Copy that." "Units en route. ETA 30 minutes, came the crackling response. 30 minutes would be too late. The python's technique was flawless. Each time Goliath exhaled, the snake tightened its grip, preventing the bull from drawing another full breath. It was a death sentence playing out in slow motion. "We need to do something now," I said, removing my service weapon. "No." Jack's voice was sharp. "No shooting, please." I watched through my binoculars, ready to override Jack's wishes if necessary. That's when I noticed something odd. Goliath's movements weren't random panic anymore. Despite the crushing pressure, the bull's eyes were alert, focused. He was looking directly at Jack, then deliberately shifting his gaze toward the old oak tree. "What in God's name?" I whispered. Goliath's massive legs strained against the ground, finding purchase in the dry earth. And impossibly, incredibly, he began to move, not in panic but with purpose, dragging both himself and the enormous python toward the ancient oak tree. "This one," Sarah had whispered, her thin hand reaching out to stroke the small Brahman calf's forehead. Jack remembered that day like it was yesterday, though it had been nearly 5 years ago now. The spring air had been sweet with wildflowers, and Sarah's cancer had been in remission for the 3rd time. They'd driven out to the Wilkins place to look at their new stock. "He's the runt," the breeder had warned. "Probably won't amount to much." But Sarah had seen something else. "Look at his eyes, Jack," she'd insisted. "There's something special there. Something knowing." She'd already named him before they left the Wilkins place. Goliath, an ironic name for the smallest calf in the herd. "He'll grow into it," she'd said with that smile that still haunted Jack's dreams. And grow he did. By the time Sarah's cancer returned for the fourth and final time, Goliath had indeed become massive, a mountain of muscle standing over 6 feet tall at the shoulder, with a distinctive white coat that gleamed like fresh snow in the Texas sun. But it wasn't his size that made him special. It was exactly what Sarah had spotted that first day, an intelligence in those deep brown eyes that sometimes sent shivers down Jack's spine. During Sarah's final months, when the pain medications left her too weak to leave the house, Jack would often bring Goliath right up to the bedroom window. The massive bull would stand there, perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Sarah would press her palm against the glass, and Goliath would gently touch his nose to the same spot on the other side. "He knows, Jack," she'd whispered one evening, 2 weeks before the end. "That bull understands more than you think." The night before Sarah passed, she'd made Jack promise to look after Goliath. "He's got a purpose," she'd insisted, her voice frail but determined. "I don't know what it is, but that animal was meant for something important. Promise me you'll keep him safe." Jack had promised, of course. He would have promised her the moon and stars if she'd asked. But in the desolate months after her funeral, that promise became his anchor. Each morning he'd rise before dawn, make his coffee, and sit on the porch watching Goliath in the early light. Sometimes he found himself talking to the bull as if he were talking to Sarah. "Going to be another scorcher today," he'd say. Or, "That fence on the north side needs mending." Mundane things that needed saying, and with Sarah gone, Goliath seemed the only one who'd listen with the same patient attention. The strangest part was how the bull would respond. A tilt of his massive head, a slow blink of those knowing eyes. It was enough to make Jack wonder if Sarah had been right all along. There had been incidents over the years that defied explanation, like the time Goliath had somehow opened the gate to the water trough when it was frozen over, allowing the other cattle to drink, or the day he'd herded a lost calf back to its mother during a dust storm. Little things that neighbors attributed to good breeding or coincidence, but Jack knew better. "That's one peculiar bull you've got there, Jack," his neighbor Wyatt Daniels had commented once. "Way he looks at a person, it's like he's taking your measure." Jack had just nodded, keeping Sarah's words to himself. Some things were too precious to share, especially with Wyatt, who'd been making increasingly generous offers to buy Whisper Creek Ranch since Sarah's passing. I had my own reasons for watching the scene unfold with such intensity that morning. 25 years earlier, my sister Elena had died in my arms, her body convulsing from the venom of a western diamondback rattlesnake. She'd been just 16, collecting wildflowers for a school project on our family's small ranch outside San Antonio. I'd found her too late, the antivenom we kept in the truck insufficient for the massive dose she'd received. I'd joined the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department the following year and had spent the next 2.5 decades developing a reputation as the go-to ranger for reptile-related incidents. My colleagues attributed it to expertise. Only my wife knew it was driven by a cold, hard hatred for the creatures that had stolen my sister's future. So, when I looked through those binoculars at Goliath struggling against that python, I wasn't just seeing another livestock incident. I was seeing a chance for delayed justice, a visceral need to destroy the predator before it could claim another victim. The rational part of me knew this was different. Pythons weren't venomous, and this was an invasive species, not a native rattler, but reason has little power over the heart's deepest wounds. "We need to kill that snake," I'd said to Jack, my hand tightening on my service weapon. "No," Jack had replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Not if there's any other way." I didn't understand his hesitation then. This was a clear-cut case. Dangerous invasive predator attacking valuable livestock. But something in Jack's expression, a desperate hope beyond reason, made me pause. "That's Sarah's bull," he'd added quietly, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. I'd known Sarah Harmon, the whole county had, a retired schoolteacher who'd organized the annual book drive and started the county's first literacy program for ranch hands' children. Sarah, who'd fought cancer with the same quiet dignity with which she'd done everything else in her life. Sarah, who'd been buried under the old oak tree on the eastern edge of Whisper Creek Ranch, the very oak tree toward which Goliath was now inexplicably dragging himself and the massive python. The python tightened its grip as Goliath moved, causing the bull to bellow in pain. Jack flinched at the sound, his weathered face contorting in anguish. "We've got to do something," he pleaded, looking at me with the same desperate hope I'd seen in the eyes of 100 people over my career, people looking to authority figures to make the impossible possible. "Backup's still 20 minutes out," I said, checking my watch. "And that snake's not going to wait." "He's trying to get to the oak," Jack said suddenly. "Sarah's oak. Look at him. He's not just struggling, he's heading somewhere specific." I raised my binoculars again, focusing on Goliath's deliberate movements. As much as I hated to admit it, Jack was right. This wasn't blind panic. The bull was moving with purpose, each labored step bringing him closer to the ancient oak tree. "What's he doing?" I muttered, more to myself than to Jack. "He's problem-solving," Jack replied, a hint of pride breaking through his fear. Sarah always said he was smarter than most people gave him credit for. As I watched Goliath's determined progress toward the oak, I found myself torn between professional responsibility and reluctant fascination. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen an animal, especially prey in the grip of a predator, display such calculated behavior, and I couldn't help but wonder, as Goliath dragged himself and his would-be killer toward Sarah's final resting place, was this merely instinct, or was there something more at work here? Something that might force me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the natural world, and about the creatures I'd spent a lifetime both studying and fearing. With every labored step, Goliath moved closer to the oak tree, his massive body straining against the python's deadly embrace. The snake, sensing movement, tightened its grip further. I could see its muscles rippling beneath its patterned skin as it applied what should have been the final, crushing pressure. Goliath's legs buckled momentarily, and Jack let out an anguished sound that wasn't quite a word. "Come on, big guy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Come on." As if hearing Jack's encouragement, Goliath found his footing again. Blood now trickled from where the python's scales had cut into his hide, streaking his white coat with crimson. Every breath seemed to cost him tremendous effort, yet the bull continued his deliberate journey toward the oak. I found myself holding my breath as I watched through the binoculars. 23 years in wildlife management, and I'd never witnessed anything like this. Animals in the grip of predators typically respond with blind panic, thrashing, fleeing, or freezing. What I was seeing defied explanation, methodical movement with clear intent. "Should I be filming this?" I asked, reaching for my department-issued phone. Jack nodded without taking his eyes off Goliath. "People need to see this." My hands shook slightly as I began recording. The department would want documentation anyway. Burmese pythons this far west represented a significant invasive species concern, but this was beyond professional interest now. After what seemed an eternity but was probably only minutes, Goliath reached the base of the ancient oak. The tree stood at least 60 feet tall, its sprawling branches casting dappled shadows across the ground. Sarah Harmon's simple granite headstone was visible at its base, partially obscured by wildflowers that Jack had obviously planted and tended. What happened next left both of us speechless. Goliath positioned himself so that the python's head was pressed against the rough bark of the oak. Then, with what could only be described as calculated precision, he began to rub the snake against the tree, using the abrasive surface to damage the predator's head. "My God," I breathed, making sure I was capturing every moment on video. The python reacted immediately, its head jerking back from the painful contact. But Goliath pressed harder, using the tree as a tool. The snake's grip loosened fractionally as it tried to protect its head, giving Goliath the slightest advantage, one he immediately exploited by taking another deliberate step and repeating the process. "He's using the tree," Jack said, his voice filled with wonder. "He's using the damn tree as a weapon." For 10 agonizing minutes, we watched as Goliath methodically continued his strategy. The python fought back, constricting with renewed vigor whenever it could, but each time its head connected with the rough bark, its hold weakened slightly. Blood, both Goliath's and the snake's, stained the base of the tree, creating a macabre pattern against the ancient oak's trunk. Finally, after one particularly forceful movement, the python's grip loosened enough for Goliath to pull free from its coils. The massive snake, disoriented and injured, slithered away into the tall grass surrounding the oak tree. Goliath stood there, sides heaving, legs trembling with exhaustion, but alive, impossibly, miraculously alive. Jack let out a whoop of joy, startling a nearby mockingbird into flight. "That's my boy," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "That's my Sarah's boy." I ended the recording, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't just unusual animal behavior. This was problem-solving at a level that challenged fundamental assumptions about bovine intelligence. Goliath hadn't just escaped, he'd strategized, using an environmental tool with purpose and precision. As a ranger, I should have been moving to track and capture the injured python. Invasive Burmese pythons represented a serious ecological threat, and department protocol was clear: capture for relocation to an approved facility or, if necessary, humane euthanasia. But I found myself frozen in place, my professional training temporarily overridden by sheer amazement. Jack was already rushing toward the gate, clearly intent on reaching Goliath. I followed, radioing dispatch to update them on the situation and advise the incoming units. "Python has been repelled by the bull," I reported, the words sounding absurd even as I said them. "Bull appears injured but ambulatory." "Python has retreated into vegetation east of the main pasture." "Copy that," came the puzzled response. "Did you say the bull repelled the python?" "Affirmative," I replied. "You're going to want to see the video." By the time we reached Goliath, the bull had moved to stand directly beside Sarah's headstone. Despite his injuries, deep abrasions where the python's scales had cut into his hide, and what appeared to be a cracked rib from the constriction, he remained standing, his sides heaving with exhaustion. Jack approached slowly, his hand outstretched. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "Easy now." Goliath lowered his massive head, allowing Jack to touch the space between his eyes, a gesture I'd seen between them earlier. The bull's breathing gradually slowed as Jack whispered words too quiet for me to hear, but which seemed to calm the animal. That's when I noticed something odd. Goliath wasn't looking at Jack anymore. His gaze had shifted to the tall grass where the python had disappeared, not with fear, as would be expected, but with what appeared to be concern. "Jack," I said quietly, "the snake's still close." Jack nodded without turning. "I know." "We need to track it and capture it," I continued, falling back on protocol. "It's injured but still dangerous, and it's an invasive species. It can't be allowed to remain in the wild." This was the moment where I expected Jack to agree. Any rational rancher would want a deadly predator removed from their property, especially one that had nearly killed their prize bull. Instead, Jack turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Let's wait," he said. "Just give it a minute." Before I could argue, the sound of vehicles approaching announced the arrival of backup. Among them was the county's wildlife veterinarian, Dr. Ellie Parker, who'd been called in due to the unusual nature of the incident. Ellie was in her late 40s, with practical, short-cropped hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd treated everything from rodeo bulls to mountain lions. She assessed the situation with a quick glance, then headed straight for Goliath. "Let me check him," she said, medical bag already in hand. As she began examining Goliath's injuries, I noticed movement in the grass. The python was emerging, its movements sluggish, blood visible on its head where the bark had scraped away scales. Instinctively, I reached for my sidearm. "Hold on," Jack said sharply, placing a restraining hand on my arm. "Look!" Goliath had seen the python too. The bull tensed, and I expected him to retreat or perhaps even charge. Instead, to my absolute astonishment, he took a single step forward, positioning himself between the snake and the humans. Ellie froze in her examination. "What's he doing?" "I think," Jack said slowly, "he's protecting it. Protecting the snake that just tried to kill him." I couldn't keep the disbelief from my voice. "That's not possible." But as we watched, Goliath did something that defied all explanation. He lowered his massive head and gently nudged the injured python with his nose, as if checking its condition. The python, rather than striking defensively as would be expected, remained still, its dark eyes fixed on the bull. "This is unprecedented," Ellie whispered, carefully moving back to give the animals space. "Prey animals don't protect predators. It goes against every survival instinct." Jack's face bore an expression of wonder mixed with vindication. "Sarah always said he was special," he murmured. The newly arrived rangers were gathering at the fence line, clearly unsure how to proceed with this bizarre situation. Their training covered standard wildlife encounters, not whatever this was. I made the decision to keep them back until we better understood what was happening. "What do we do about the python?" one of them called out. "Protocol says—" "I know what protocol says," I cut him off. "But this isn't a standard situation." Ellie had set down her medical bag and was observing the interaction with professional interest. "The python needs medical attention," she stated matter-of-factly. "Those head injuries could be fatal without treatment." And here was the controversy, the moment where professional duty collided with the unprecedented scene before us. Department protocol was clear regarding invasive species, particularly dangerous ones like the Burmese python. Yet euthanizing this particular snake felt increasingly wrong as we watched its gentle interaction with Goliath. "It deserves a chance," Jack said quietly. "After what I just saw, it deserves a chance." I found myself torn between my ranger training and the nagging sense that we were witnessing something extraordinary, something that perhaps deserved scientific study rather than bureaucratic response. "If we treat it," I said slowly, "we'd need to relocate it to a secure facility afterward. It can't remain in the wild." "My ranch has secure facilities," Jack offered immediately. "The old horse barn could be converted." "That would require special permits," I countered, "and the python would need treatment within the next 24 hours to survive those injuries." And so the clock began ticking again, not just for the python's survival, but for a decision that would challenge everything I thought I knew about natural law and department protocol. 24 hours to decide the fate of two unlikely companions, one of whom should have been the other's last meal. As we debated, Goliath remained steadfast in his protective stance, his massive form casting a shadow over the injured python. The sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, promising another scorching day, while beneath Sarah's oak tree, a bull and a python rewrote everything I thought I knew about the natural world. Dr. Ellie Parker knelt beside the injured python, her movements slow and deliberate. Despite 20 years of veterinary experience, she approached this particular snake with unusual caution, not out of fear, but respect. Goliath watched her every move, his massive frame tensed as if ready to intervene should she cause harm. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured, gently examining the python's wounded head. "These injuries are severe, but treatable. The real question is why this bull is protecting his would-be killer." Jack stood nearby, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. "Sarah always said animals understand more than we give them credit for." "Well, your Sarah might have been right," Ellie admitted, reaching into her medical kit. "But there's something else strange here. This python is massive, easily 20 feet long. That's well beyond the typical size for even female Burmese pythons in the wild." I frowned, kneeling beside her while maintaining a respectful distance from both animals. "Could it be a particularly old specimen?" "Possibly," Ellie said, but her tone suggested doubt. As she continued her examination, she suddenly paused, her fingers finding something embedded beneath the scales near the python's head. "There's something here. Feels like metal." Using specialized tools from her kit, she carefully exposed what appeared to be a small metal object about the size of a grain of rice. "It's a tracking device," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "And not a standard wildlife tag either." "What kind is it?" I asked, leaning closer. Ellie turned the tiny device over in her gloved hand. "Military grade," she said quietly. "I've seen these before when I consulted on that wildlife tracking program at Fort Hood." The implications hung in the air between us. This wasn't just any invasive species that had made its way north from Florida. This snake had been deliberately tracked and possibly released. "Why would the military be tracking a python?" Jack asked, his face clouded with confusion. "That's the million-dollar question," I replied, already reaching for my phone to make some calls. Before I could dial, however, it rang in my hand. The caller ID showed it was Deputy Director Simmons, my immediate superior. "Webb," I answered, stepping away from the others. "Mason, I just got a very interesting call from Homeland Security," Simmons said without preamble. "They say you've got a python there with a tracking device?" I blinked in surprise. "How could they possibly know that? We just found it ourselves." "The device must have some kind of alert system," Simmons replied. "Listen carefully. A team from Fort Hood is on their way to your location. Until they arrive, you're to secure that tracking device and ensure both animals remain on site." "Sir, what's going on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I don't have full clearance to know, but I'm told this relates to an operation tracking illegal exotic animal trafficking. That python may be evidence." After ending the call, I returned to the others with this new information. "Seems our python friend here is mixed up in something bigger than we thought," I explained. "Homeland Security and military personnel are on their way." Jack's expression darkened. "I don't care who's coming. I'm not letting them harm either of these animals." "No one said anything about harming them," I assured him, though in truth, I had no idea what the arriving authorities would intend. While we waited, Ellie continued treating the python's wounds with Goliath's watchful permission. The scene was surreal, a veterinarian tending to a predator under the protective gaze of its intended prey. If I hadn't been witnessing it firsthand, I would never have believed it. My phone chimed with an incoming message. It was from Rodriguez, one of our tech specialists back at headquarters. "You need to see this," the message read, followed by a link. I clicked it, and my screen filled with an image that made my blood run cold. It was a screenshot from an encrypted website one clearly designed for illegal exotic animal sales. And there, featured prominently, was a photo of Goliath, described as a rare white Brahman bull with unusual intelligence. The asking price made me wince, $200,000. Below Goliath's listing was another for a giant Burmese python, specially bred for size and aggression. The photo matched our python perfectly, right down to a distinctive pattern of scales on its head. "Jack," I said slowly, "someone's been watching your ranch. And they've been advertising your bull online." I showed him the screen, watching as his face transformed from confusion to rage. "Who would do this?" he demanded. My mind immediately went to his neighbor. "You mentioned Wyatt Daniels has been trying to buy your place?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "For 3 years now. Keeps raising his offer every few months. Has he been on your property recently?" "He stops by regularly, says he's being neighborly, but I always figured he was just checking if I'm desperate enough to sell yet." Jack paused, realization dawning. "You think Wyatt's involved in this?" "I think it's worth looking into," I replied, forwarding the screenshots to Simmons with a request to investigate Daniels. Ellie had finished bandaging the python's head wounds and was now examining Goliath. "This bull needs antibiotics and pain management," she announced. "The python's constriction caused some deep tissue bruising and possibly a cracked rib. And these cuts need cleaning to prevent infection." As she spoke, Goliath suddenly tensed, his massive head swinging toward the ranch entrance. The python, despite its injuries, also became alert, its body shifting into a more defensive posture. "Something's wrong," Jack said, instinctively moving closer to Goliath. I followed their gaze and spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Vehicles approaching fast. Too fast for the military team Simmons had mentioned. They wouldn't have arrived so quickly. "Get inside," I ordered, my hand moving to my sidearm. "Now." "I'm not leaving Goliath," Jack protested. "Then get him into the barn," I countered. "And the python too, if you can. Something doesn't feel right." The approaching vehicles were now visible. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, moving with purpose down the long driveway to Whisper Creek Ranch. No markings, no license plates visible at this distance. I radioed the rangers stationed at the perimeter. "Unidentified vehicles approaching from the main entrance. Hold positions and be ready to intercept." "Copy that," came the response. "We see them. 3 SUVs, no plates, heavily tinted." Jack was already moving, urging Goliath toward the barn with gentle words and gestures. To my amazement, the massive bull seemed to understand the urgency, moving with purpose despite his injuries. Even more surprisingly, the python followed them, slithering alongside with apparent purpose. "Ellie, go with them," I directed. "I'll handle this." She nodded, gathering her medical supplies quickly. "Be careful, Mason." As they retreated to the barn, I positioned myself near Sarah's oak tree, radio in one hand and my other resting on my holstered weapon. The approaching vehicles slowed as they neared the house, coming to a stop in a formation that blocked the main drive. The doors opened and men emerged, 6 of them, dressed in expensive but casual clothes that couldn't quite hide their professional bearing, private security most likely, and well-trained. The last man to exit was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. "That's Victor Rhodes," one of the rangers radioed to me. "He runs that big game hunting operation down near the border. Been investigated multiple times for wildlife trafficking, but nothing ever sticks." The name was familiar. Rhodes had powerful friends in state politics and enough lawyers to tie up any investigation in years of litigation. If he was here personally, the situation was more serious than I'd imagined. "This is a secure scene under Texas Parks and Wildlife jurisdiction," I called out as they approached. "State your business." Rhodes smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "Ranger Webb, I presume." Victor Rhodes. He extended a hand I didn't take. I understand you found something unusual on this property. How would you know what we found? I challenged. Rhodes waved dismissively. Word travels fast in small communities. I'm something of a reptile enthusiast, and when I heard about an unusually large python, I thought I might offer my expertise. It was a smooth lie, delivered with practiced ease. The tracking device in the python and Rhodes's appearance were no coincidence. This is an active investigation site, I replied. If you'd like to offer assistance, you can contact our department headquarters. Rhodes's smile tightened slightly. I see. Well, perhaps I should speak with Mr. Harmon directly. I understand it's his bull that was attacked. I might be interested in purchasing the animal. For its safety, of course. And there it was, the real reason for his visit. Rhodes wanted Goliath, just as the online listing had advertised. The python had likely been released near Whisper Creek Ranch deliberately, either to kill Goliath or to create an opportunity for Rhodes to swoop in and rescue the valuable bull. Mr. Harmon isn't receiving visitors, I said firmly, and I'll need you and your men to leave the premises immediately. Rhodes studied me for a long moment, his expression calculating. You know, Ranger Webb, I've always had great respect for Texas law enforcement. Such dedication, often for so little compensation. He reached into his jacket, producing a business card. If you ever decide your talents are underutilized in public service, I'm always looking for good men with your skills. A bribe, thinly veiled but unmistakable. I didn't take the card. I'll give you 1 minute to return to your vehicles, I stated, my voice hardening. After that, you'll be detained for interfering with an official investigation. Behind me, I heard the barn door open. Jack emerged, his ancient shotgun cradled in his arms. Stupid, brave Jack. He'd never leave anyone to face danger alone on his property. "Everything all right, Ranger Webb?" he called, his voice carrying across the yard. Rhodes's attention shifted to Jack, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Harmon, I presume? Victor Rhodes? I was just expressing my interest in your remarkable bull." "Not for sale," Jack replied curtly. "None of my animals are." "Everything has a price," Rhodes countered smoothly. "Especially unique specimens. I'm prepared to make a very generous offer. Enough for you to retire comfortably, perhaps move somewhere with fewer predators." The threat was subtle but clear. Jack's grip on his shotgun tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Like I said, not for sale. Now I believe the ranger asked you to leave." For a tense moment I thought Rhodes might press the issue. His security personnel had subtly spread out, hands near concealed weapons. But with other rangers watching and witnesses present, a direct confrontation would be too risky even for someone with Rhodes's connections. "As you wish," he finally said, his casual tone belied by the cold calculation in his eyes. "But do keep my offer in mind, Mr. Harmon. The Texas wilderness can be so unpredictable, especially for aging ranchers living alone." With that parting threat, Rhodes and his men returned to their vehicles and departed, leaving behind a cloud of dust and an unmistakable promise of trouble to come. "Friend of yours?" Jack asked dryly as we watched the SUVs disappear down the driveway. "Victor Rhodes," I explained. "Suspected wildlife trafficker with connections in high places, and I'd bet my badge he's behind that online listing of Goliath." Jack's expression darkened. "And the python?" "Probably released specifically to target your bull," I admitted. Though I doubt Rhodes expected the outcome we witnessed. We returned to the barn, where Ellie had continued treating both animals. Goliath lay on a bed of fresh straw, his massive sides rising and falling steadily. The python had positioned itself nearby, its bandaged head resting on a folded blanket Ellie had provided. "They're both stable," she reported. "But we have a clock ticking. That python needs specialized care within the next 24 hours, or those head injuries could become infected." And so we faced a new deadline, not just the python's medical needs, but the knowledge that Victor Rhodes would almost certainly return, and next time he wouldn't be deterred so easily. Whatever connection had formed between Goliath and the python, it had just become even more complicated by human greed and cruelty. As I watched the unlikely pair resting together in the barn, predator and prey, each seeming to draw comfort from the other's presence, I was struck by a realization that Sarah Harmon had apparently understood years ago. Sometimes the most profound connections emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. And sometimes protecting those connections requires confronting not just the dangers of the natural world, but the far more insidious threats posed by human avarice. Night fell over Whisper Creek Ranch, bringing a slight relief from the day's oppressive heat. The barn had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with ranger vehicles positioned strategically around the perimeter and floodlights illuminating the approaches. Inside, Jack sat on an overturned feed bucket beside Goliath, occasionally stroking the bull's broad forehead as he dozed. I stood at the barn door, watching the darkness for any signs of movement. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from Rodriguez. "Surveillance cameras set up. Motion sensors active. No movement yet." Good. At least we'd have some warning if Rhodes and his men returned. Ellie emerged from the small tack room she'd converted into a treatment area, wiping her hands on a towel. "The python's resting comfortably," she reported. "I've done what I can with my field kit, but those head injuries need specialized treatment." "The team from Fort Hood should be here by morning," I replied. "They'll have resources we don't." She nodded, her eyes drifting to where Jack sat with Goliath. "That bull should be dead," she said quietly. "The python's constriction was powerful enough to crush his rib cage. Somehow he not only survived, but managed to protect his attacker afterward. It defies everything I know about animal behavior." I couldn't argue with her assessment. My 23 years as a ranger had taught me that nature follows certain rules. Predators hunt prey. Prey fears predators. Survival instinct overrides all else. Yet here we were, watching a bull stand guard over the very creature that had nearly killed him. My radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "Perimeter check clear," reported Ranger Martinez. "No sign of Rhodes or his men." "Copy that," I responded. "Maintain hourly checks throughout the night." As I set down the radio, memories of another night vigil surfaced unbidden. The night my sister Elena died. I'd been 18, she 16, both of us home from school for the summer. Our parents had driven into San Antonio for supplies, leaving us to watch the ranch. Elena had been collecting wildflowers for a school project, venturing into the back pasture despite my warnings about snakes. When she didn't return for dinner, I'd gone looking, finding her collapsed near the old creek bed, her skin already ashen, a distinctive bite mark on her ankle. I'd carried her back to the house, applied a tourniquet, called for help, but we lived 30 minutes from the nearest hospital, and the antivenin we kept in the first aid kit wasn't enough. I'd held her as the venom worked through her system, watched helplessly as her breathing grew labored, her pulse weakened. "Stay with me, Ellie," I'd begged, using the childhood nickname she'd outgrown. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." But help had arrived too late. She'd died in my arms, her last words a whispered apology for not listening to my warning. I joined the Parks and Wildlife Department the following year, channeling my grief into a focused determination to understand and control the creatures that had taken my sister. And now, watching a Burmese python rest peacefully in a Texas barn, I found myself questioning the hatred I'd carried for over 2 decades. "Penny for your thoughts," Jack said quietly, interrupting my reflection. He'd moved to stand beside me at the barn door, his eyes reflecting the distant floodlights. "Just remembering someone," I replied. Jack nodded, not pressing further. We stood in companionable silence for a while, two men united by unusual circumstances. "Sarah would have loved this," he finally said. "Not the danger, mind you, but seeing Goliath like this, proving her right about him being special. She sounds like she was quite a woman." Jack smiled faintly. "The best. Smart as a whip and stubborn as a mule. When the doctors gave her 6 months, she lived for 18, said she wasn't going anywhere until she'd finished her last quilt and seen Goliath fully grown." "And did she?" "Finished the quilt the week before she passed. As for Goliath," he gestured toward the massive bull, "she saw enough to know he was something extraordinary." Inside the barn, Goliath shifted in his sleep, a low rumble escaping his throat. The python, resting nearby on a bed of straw, lifted its head at the sound. For a tense moment, I wondered if the strange truce between them had broken. Then, incredibly, the python moved closer to Goliath, its body curling alongside the bull's massive flank. "Would you look at that?" Jack murmured. "It's like they're comforting each other." Ellie had noticed too, approaching cautiously to observe the interaction. "This is unprecedented," she whispered. There's scientific documentation of unusual cross-species bonding, a lioness adopting an antelope calf, elephants protecting other animals, but nothing like this, not between a predator and the prey it actively attacked. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Rodriguez. "Found something on Daniels. His property was recently visited by Rhodes. Satellite imagery confirms." So Jack's neighbor was indeed connected to Rhodes. The pieces were falling into place. Wyatt Daniels had likely been monitoring Goliath for months, feeding information to Rhodes's trafficking operation. The python had probably been released on or near Whisper Creek Ranch deliberately, creating a crisis that Rhodes could exploit. "Jack," I said, "I need to ask you something. Has Daniels ever shown particular interest in Goliath?" Jack frowned, considering. "Now that you mention it, he always seems to ask about him, compliments him, wants to know about his bloodline." I figured he was just making conversation. "Did he ever take pictures of him?" "All the time. Said he was thinking of getting into Brahmins himself, wanted references for good stock." Jack's expression darkened as understanding dawned. "That snake in the grass was cataloging my bull for Rhodes, wasn't he?" Before I could answer, my radio crackled again. "Movement at the eastern perimeter," Martinez reported urgently. "Single vehicle approaching through the back pasture, lights off." "Rhodes?" I asked. "Negative. It's a pickup truck. Local plates." Jack and I exchanged glances. "Daniels," he said grimly. "Stay here with Ellie and the animals," I instructed, already heading for the door. "Lock it behind me." Outside, I met up with Martinez and 2 other rangers near the eastern fence line. In the distance, we could see the faint outline of a pickup making its way slowly across the pasture, using the natural contours of the land for concealment. "Hold positions," I ordered. "Let's see what he's up to before we make contact." The truck stopped about 100 yards from the barn, still partially obscured by a rise in the terrain. A figure emerged. Wyatt Daniels, carrying what appeared to be a rifle. "Texas Parks and Wildlife, drop your weapon," I called out, my voice amplified by the portable speaker Martinez carried. Daniels froze, then immediately dropped the rifle and raised his hands. "Don't shoot. I'm just checking on Jack." "At midnight? With a rifle? Through his back pasture?" I approached cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on him. "On your knees, hands behind your head." As Daniels complied, I retrieved his rifle, a high-powered hunting model with a sophisticated night vision scope. "Just doing some predator control," Daniels explained, his voice strained with false casualness. "Heard Jack had trouble with a big snake. Thought I'd help out. By sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night?" I secured his weapon and motioned for Martinez to cuff him. Mr. Daniels, we have evidence linking you to Victor Rhodes and an illegal exotic animal trafficking operation. I suggest you start talking. Daniels' face drained of color. I don't know what you're— Save it, I cut him off. We have satellite imagery of Rhodes visiting your property, and we've found the online listings for Goliath and the Python. The only question now is how deep you're involved. For a moment, Daniels maintained his innocent act. Then, seeing the evidence stacked against him, his demeanor changed. Rhodes will kill me if I talk, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Rhodes isn't here, I countered. But I am, and right now your cooperation is the only thing that might keep you out of federal prison. Martinez led Daniels to one of the ranger vehicles, while I called Simmons with an update. We've apprehended Wyatt Daniels attempting to enter the property armed. He's implicated Rhodes but claims he's afraid to provide details. Good work, Simmons replied. The team from Fort Hood will be there at 0600. Homeland Security wants Rhodes's entire operation, not just the foot soldiers. See if you can get Daniels to wear a wire. By the time I returned to the barn, Jack was pacing anxiously near the entrance. Was it Wyatt? He demanded. I nodded. Caught him sneaking in with a rifle. He's cooperating now, somewhat. Jack's expression hardened. That backstabbing son of a— He cut himself off, glancing toward where Goliath rested. I trusted him. Let him into my home, all while he was setting me up for Rhodes. We'll get Rhodes, I assured him. But right now, our priority is protecting you, Goliath, and our unexpected guest. I nodded toward the python, which had curled itself into a protective position near Goliath's head. As we watched, the python suddenly became alert, its head rising slightly. Goliath, too, seemed to sense something, his massive body shifting as he struggled to stand despite his injuries. Something's wrong, Ellie said, moving closer to the animals. Jack turned to me, his weathered face taut with concern. They know something we don't. I reached for my radio to check with the perimeter team, but before I could call, an urgent transmission came through. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north and west, reported Ranger Johnson. They've taken out our surveillance cameras. Rhodes was making his move, and he wasn't being subtle this time. How many? I demanded. At least 4 vehicles that we can see. Professional operation, they're flanking us. I made a quick decision. Fall back to the barn. We're outnumbered. Within minutes, the remaining Rangers had joined us inside the barn. Martinez had moved Daniels there as well, keeping him handcuffed and under guard. Rhodes won't care that you've got me, Daniels said, his voice tinged with genuine fear. He'll kill us all and take the animals. Not if I can help it, I replied, already dialing Simmons again. We need immediate backup. Rhodes is here in force. SWAT team is mobilizing, Simmons responded, but they're 30 minutes out at best. 30 minutes we might not have. I surveyed our defenses. 6 Rangers, including myself, all armed but not equipped for a siege against professional mercenaries. Jack's barn was sturdy but not bulletproof, and we had wounded animals to protect. Jack approached me, his voice low. There's a root cellar under the barn, he said. Sarah insisted on it when we rebuilt after the fire in '09. It's not much, but it could hide Goliath and the python. Can Goliath manage stairs in his condition? I asked. It's a sloped earthen ramp, Jack explained. He can make it. Sarah designed it as a tornado shelter for the animals. I nodded. Show me. Jack led me to the back of the barn, moving aside a stack of hay bales to reveal a trap door. Beneath it, a wide ramp descended into darkness. The space below was surprisingly large, a concrete reinforced chamber with ventilation shafts and even rudimentary lighting powered by a small generator. Sarah thought of everything, I murmured, impressed. She survived 3 tornadoes growing up, Jack replied. Said she'd never be caught unprepared again. We worked quickly, with Ellie guiding Goliath down the ramp despite his injuries. To our amazement, the python followed without prompting, slithering alongside the bull as if they'd formed some unspoken pact. Once the animals were secured below, I gathered the rangers for a final briefing. Rhodes wants these animals alive, which gives us an advantage. He can't just storm in, guns blazing. Our job is to hold this position until SWAT arrives. Outside, vehicle headlights swept across the barn as Rhodes's men took up positions. A spotlight fixed on the main door and a voice called out through a megaphone. "Ranger Webb, this is Victor Rhodes. I believe you have something that belongs to me." I didn't respond, instead positioning the rangers at strategic points throughout the barn. "I'm a reasonable man, Ranger," Rhodes continued. "Release the animals to me and everyone walks away. Resist and, well, accidents happen in the line of duty all the time." The threat hung in the air, clear and chilling. I checked my watch. 25 minutes until SWAT could reach us. 25 minutes to keep Rhodes at bay without triggering a firefight. We couldn't win. Down in the cellar, Goliath and the python waited in unlikely alliance. Predator and prey, united by circumstances neither could understand, but both seemed to accept. And as I prepared to defend them against the true predators outside, I couldn't help but think of Elena and how she might view my current mission to protect the very type of creature that had taken her life. "I think she'd be proud," Jack said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "Protecting life, no matter what form it takes, that's what rangers do, isn't it?" I nodded, strangely comforted by his words. Outside, Rhodes was growing impatient, his men moving into position for what would likely be an imminent assault. The clock was ticking down, and the next few minutes would determine whether our unusual charges would survive to see the dawn. "Last chance, Ranger Webb!" Rhodes's voice boomed through the megaphone, slicing through the tense silence inside the barn. 10 seconds to make the smart decision." I exchanged glances with Martinez, both of us positioned behind hay bales near the front entrance. Our other 4 rangers were strategically placed at windows in the rear door, each holding position with the disciplined stillness that came from years of training. "SWAT is still 18 minutes out," Martinez whispered, checking his phone. "Think we can hold them that long?" Before I could answer, the spotlight outside went dark, plunging the barn into near-total darkness save for our tactical flashlights. The sudden absence of light was more threatening than any verbal ultimatum. Rhodes was done talking. "Night vision," I warned, keeping my voice low. "They're going to try to use the darkness as cover." Jack and Ellie were down in the cellar with the animals, the trapdoor secured from the inside. At least they'd be relatively safe if things went sideways up here. The first shot came without warning. A single rifle report that shattered one of the high windows, sending glass raining down. It wasn't aimed at us, just a warning, a demonstration of their firepower. "They're trying to spook us," I told the team. "Hold positions." The radio at my belt crackled. "Ranger Webb?" It was Jack, calling from the cellar. "Something's happening down here. The animals are reacting to something." "What do you mean?" I whispered into the radio. "Goliath's on his feet despite his injuries, and the pythons become extremely active. It's like they sense something we don't." I'd seen enough unusual behavior from these animals today to take Jack's observations seriously. "Are they agitated? Trying to escape?" "No," Jack replied after a pause. "They're both focused on the eastern wall of the cellar. The python keeps pressing against it, and Goliath's pawing at the ground. The eastern wall, that would face away from Rhodes and his men toward the open pasture. Could there be another threat approaching from that direction? Or were the animals simply responding to the tension above? Before I could puzzle it out further, a small object crashed through another window, landing with a metallic clatter on the barn floor. "Tear gas!" Martinez shouted just as the canister began spewing its noxious contents. "Masks on!" I ordered, pulling my emergency respirator from my belt. Not all the rangers carried them, Standard issue for search and rescue operations, but not typical for wildlife management. Those without masks began coughing almost immediately. Through the thickening gas, I could make out shapes moving outside, Rhodes's men positioning for entry. We were rapidly losing our defensive advantage. "Fall back to the cellar," I commanded, helping a coughing Ranger Johnson toward the back of the barn. "Martinez, cover our retreat." We moved as a unit toward the hidden trapdoor, maintaining suppressive fire to keep Rhodes's men from rushing the barn. The tear gas was making visibility nearly impossible, our eyes streaming despite the partial protection of the masks. Just as we reached the hay bales concealing the cellar entrance, the main barn doors burst open. 3 men in tactical gear rushed in, weapons raised. "Down!" I shouted, pulling Johnson to the floor as Martinez fired 2 warning shots over the intruders' heads. "Texas Rangers!" Martinez identified us. "Drop your weapons!" Instead of complying, the men took cover behind farm equipment, returning fire that splintered wood inches from my head. This was no longer about capturing animals. Rhodes had escalated to deadly force. I raised my radio again. "Jack, we're coming down. Be ready to open the trapdoor fast." "There's a problem." Jack's voice came back, tight with tension. "The animals are blocking the entrance. They won't move away from the eastern wall." "Make them move!" I hissed, ducking as another bullet whizzed overhead. "I've tried. Something's got their attention and they won't budge." We were trapped, pinned down by Rhodes's men in a gas-filled barn, with our escape route blocked by a bull and a python fixated on something none of us could perceive. Then Johnson, still coughing from the gas, grabbed my arm. "Listen," he managed, between wheezes. Through the gunfire and chaos, I strained to hear what had caught his attention. It took a moment, but then I registered it. A rhythmic thumping sound coming from the direction of the cellar, not random noise, but deliberate, like someone or something pounding on the eastern wall. "Jack," I radioed, "is that you making that noise?" "No," he replied, his voice filled with bewilderment. "It's coming from outside the cellar. Something's trying to get in." A new fear gripped me. What if Rhodes had men approaching from the east as well? What if they'd found another entrance to the cellar? I had to make a decision. "Martinez, Johnson, hold this position. Provide covering fire but conserve ammunition. I'm going to check the eastern pasture." "That's suicide," Martinez objected. "Rhodes's men have the barn surrounded." "Maybe not the eastern side," I countered. "The animals are fixated on something over there. I need to know what." Using the chaos and tear gas as cover, I crawled toward the small side door that opened onto the eastern pasture. Bullets continued to fly, but the gas was working to our advantage now, making it difficult for Rhodes's men to target us accurately. I reached the side door and eased it open just enough to peer out. The eastern pasture was bathed in moonlight, apparently unguarded. No sign of Rhodes's men in that direction. They were concentrating their forces on the main entrance and western approach. Taking a deep breath, I slipped outside, staying low and moving quickly toward the eastern wall of the barn where the cellar would be. The pounding sound was louder here, punctuated by what sounded like frantic digging. As I rounded the corner, I froze in disbelief. There, illuminated by moonlight, was a massive python, nearly identical to the one inside but with different markings, attempting to burrow into the ground where the cellar wall would be. Behind it, emerging from the tall grass, was another python, equally large. My hand moved instinctively to my weapon, but I hesitated. These snakes weren't behaving aggressively toward me. They seemed entirely focused on reaching the cellar, on reaching the python inside. A wild theory formed in my mind. I raised my radio. "Jack, ask Ellie if pythons form social bonds." "Family groups, maybe?" There was a moment of confusion before Ellie's voice came through. "Some studies suggest they might recognize relatives, but it's not well documented." "Why?" "Because I'm looking at 2 more pythons outside the cellar wall trying to dig their way in." "That's impossible," she replied. "Burmese pythons don't travel in groups in the wild." Yet the evidence was right in front of me. Two massive pythons, seemingly intent on reaching the one inside. If these weren't natural behaviors, what was driving them? A bullet struck the ground near my feet, reminding me of the more immediate danger. Rhodes's men had spotted me. I dove for cover behind an old tractor, radioing Martinez. "I've got two more pythons out here, and Rhodes's men have me pinned down." "More pythons?" Martinez sounded incredulous. "How many of these things are there?" Before I could respond, a deafening crash came from inside the barn, followed by shouts and gunfire. Through the radio, I heard Martinez yelling, "The bull! It's broken through the trap door!" The situation was spiraling out of control. I peered around the tractor in time to see Rhodes himself emerging from an SUV parked behind his men, a tranquilizer rifle in his hands. He was going for the animals personally now. I had seconds to act before Rhodes's men reached me. In a decision that defied all my training and instincts, I holstered my weapon and turned to the pythons still digging at the cellar wall. "Hey!" I called, moving closer to them despite every nerve in my body screaming in protest. "Your friend is in there, isn't it? You're trying to help." The pythons paused, their heads turning toward me with unnerving synchronicity. I'd spent my career avoiding close contact with large reptiles, and now I was deliberately approaching two massive pythons in the middle of a firefight. "I can help you reach the other python," I said, pointing toward the barn's side door. "This way." To my astonishment, the pythons seemed to understand, or at least they responded to my gesturing. They stopped digging and oriented toward me, their tongues flicking rapidly to process my scent and movements. Swallowing my lifelong fear, I began moving toward the side door, glancing back to see if they were following. They were, their massive bodies slithering through the grass with surprising speed. I reached the door and pulled it open, my heart pounding. "Martinez," I radioed. "I'm coming in the east door with reinforcements. Hold your fire." "Reinforcements? What the hell are you—" Martinez's voice cut off as I entered with the two pythons close behind me. The scene inside the barn was chaos. The trapdoor had been shattered from below, and Goliath stood in the center of the room, bleeding afresh from his earlier wounds, but standing in a protective stance. The python from the cellar was beside him, its body partially coiled as if ready to strike. Rhodes's men had fallen back momentarily, clearly unprepared for the bull's sudden appearance. Rhodes himself stood at the main entrance, tranquilizer rifle raised. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice cold and controlled. "These animals are worth more alive than dead." The two pythons that had followed me paused just inside the door, their attention immediately fixing on the third python by Goliath. A series of subtle movements passed between them, heads bobbing, tongues flicking rapidly, some form of communication we couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, in perfect coordination, all three pythons began to move, not toward Goliath, not toward us, but toward Rhodes and his men. Rhodes fired the tranquilizer dart, striking the lead python, but it continued advancing as if the sedative had no effect. His men began backing away, their expressions changing from confidence to uncertainty to fear. "Shoot them!" Rhodes ordered, discarding the tranquilizer rifle and drawing a handgun. But before anyone could fire, Goliath charged, his massive bulk moving with surprising speed despite his injuries. Rhodes's men scattered, two of them dropping their weapons in their haste to escape the enraged bull. In the confusion, Martinez and Johnson seized the opportunity to disarm the remaining men inside the barn. I moved toward Rhodes, who stood frozen in disbelief at the sight of three enormous pythons advancing on him in coordinated movement. "Victor Rhodes," I announced, drawing my sidearm, "you're under arrest for wildlife trafficking, attempted murder of law enforcement officers, and about a dozen other charges we'll sort out later." Rhodes's composure finally broke. "This is insanity," he hissed, his eyes darting between me and the approaching pythons. "Those animals are working together. "It's not possible." "Seems like nature's full of surprises," I replied, keeping my weapon trained on him as the pythons continued their advance, herding Rhodes and his remaining men into a corner of the barn. Sirens wailed in the distance, SWAT finally arriving. But the danger had already passed. Rhodes's men, faced with the unlikely alliance of a bull and 3 massive pythons, had surrendered, their weapons abandoned on the barn floor. As the tear gas began to dissipate, Jack emerged from the cellar with Ellie, both staring in amazement at the scene before them. 3 pythons forming a living barrier between Rhodes's men and Goliath, who stood bleeding but triumphant in the center of the barn. "I've never seen anything like this," Ellie whispered, her scientific mind clearly struggling to process what she was witnessing. "This isn't just unusual behavior. It's impossible behavior." Jack moved slowly toward Goliath, his hand outstretched. "Easy, big guy," he murmured. "You did good. Real good." Goliath lowered his massive head, allowing Jack to touch the space between his eyes, that familiar gesture of connection. But the bull's attention remained fixed on Rhodes, as if recognizing the true predator in their midst. The pythons, too, maintained their positions, their bodies forming a protective circle around Goliath and Jack. Whatever connection had formed between these natural enemies, it was strong enough to override millennia of evolutionary programming. As SWAT officers poured into the barn to secure Rhodes and his men, I found myself standing beside the python we'd first encountered, the one that had attacked Goliath but then been protected by him. Its injuries were clearly causing it pain, yet it had risen to defend the bull when danger threatened. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out my hand toward the python, stopping just short of touching it. The massive snake turned its head toward me, its dark eye reflecting the tactical lights of the SWAT team. For a moment, predator and protector regarded each other across an unbridgeable gulf of understanding. Then, in a gesture that sent chills down my spine, the python lowered its head slightly, almost a nod of acknowledgement, before turning back to maintain its vigilance over Rhodes and his captured men. In that moment I thought of Elena again, of how she'd loved all creatures despite my warnings about their dangers. Perhaps she'd understood something I'd spent 25 years refusing to see, that nature's categories of predator and prey, friend and enemy, were far more fluid than human understanding could encompass. And as morning light began to filter through the barn's shattered windows, illuminating the unlikely alliance that had thwarted Rhodes's plans, I wondered what other miracles might be possible if we could set aside our deepest fears and preconceptions, as Goliath had somehow done in that pivotal moment beneath Sarah's oak tree. Dawn broke over Whisper Creek Ranch, bathing the chaotic scene in golden light. SWAT team members led Rhodes and his men to waiting vehicles, their wrists secured behind their backs. Federal agents had arrived as well, documenting evidence and taking statements. The 3 pythons remained close to Goliath, forming a protective perimeter that even the most seasoned law enforcement officers approached with caution. I stood with Simmons near the barn entrance, watching as Ellie examined Goliath's fresh wounds. The bull had torn open several of his earlier injuries during his dramatic charge, and blood matted his white coat in alarming patches. "He needs surgery," Ellie announced, her voice tight with concern. "Those broken ribs are dangerously close to puncturing a lung. We need to get him to a large animal veterinary facility immediately." Jack's face paled. "The nearest one's an hour away in San Angelo. We'll arrange transport," Simmons assured him. "Our priority is stabilizing these animals." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, the largest of the 3 pythons, the one I'd first encountered outside the cellar wall, moved closer to Goliath, its massive body shifting to provide support as the bull swayed on unsteady legs. "I've never seen anything like this," murmured a federal agent recording the interaction on his phone. "It's like they're communicating. Ellie, ever the scientist despite the extraordinary circumstances, nodded thoughtfully. They are communicating, just not in ways we typically recognize. Pythons have excellent chemosensory abilities through their Jacobson's organ. They're likely picking up on stress hormones, pheromones, and other chemical signals. That doesn't explain why they're helping each other, I pointed out, especially why they're helping Goliath. No, she admitted, that defies conventional understanding. A commotion near the transport vehicles drew our attention. One of Rhodes's men, the driver of the lead SUV, was speaking urgently to the federal agents. After a brief discussion, an agent approached us. "We may have a situation," he said quietly. "According to Rhodes's driver, there's another python loose on the property. Apparently they released 4 in total, targeting different areas of the ranch." Jack looked stricken. 4? But we only have 3 here. Where's the 4th? I asked. The driver, now standing between 2 SWAT officers, called out, "We released it near the old stock pond on the western edge. Rhodes wanted to drive the bull toward it if the first attack failed." Without discussion, Jack and I moved toward my truck, both understanding the urgency. A massive python loose on the ranch posed a danger to the other livestock and potentially to the neighboring properties. "I'll drive," I said, taking the keys. "You navigate." As we pulled away, I saw Ellie organizing the care and transport of Goliath and the 3 pythons, her professional demeanor masking what must have been profound scientific confusion. The bond between these natural enemies had no precedent in her extensive experience, yet she was adapting to the reality before her with remarkable composure. Jack directed me across the pastures toward the stock pond, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Sarah loved that pond," he said quietly. "Used to sit there for hours with her sketchbook, drawing the wildlife." I nodded, understanding that every part of this ranch held memories of his wife. "Jack, there's something I need to tell you about those pythons." "What's that?" I hesitated, struggling to frame a theory that sounded impossible even to me. When I was outside the cellar, the 2 pythons weren't just trying to dig in randomly. They were responding to the one inside, the one that attacked Goliath. Responding how? Like they knew it. Like they were trying to help it. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. 20 years ago, I rescued a clutch of snake eggs from a brush fire near the border. They were unusual, too large for native species. I released the hatchlings in a remote area, figuring they'd be safer there than destroyed as invasives. Jack looked at me sharply. "You think these are those snakes? After 20 years? The one that attacked Goliath has a distinctive scale pattern, 3 diamond shapes on the back of its head. One of those hatchlings had the same marking." I swallowed hard. I remember because it reminded me of my sister's birthmark. Understanding dawned on Jack's face. "You saved it. And now it's here, all these years later. If I'm right, then I'm responsible for this situation." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career protecting people from dangerous wildlife, yet I might have inadvertently introduced these predators into the ecosystem. "Responsible?" Jack shook his head. "Or maybe you're part of something bigger. Sarah would have called it divine orchestration, everything happening for a reason, even if we can't see it yet." We reached the stock pond, a kidney-shaped body of water surrounded by cattails and scrub brush. In the dawn light, the surface was mirror smooth, reflecting the pink-tinged clouds overhead. "Where would a python hide around here?" Jack wondered aloud as we exited the truck. I scanned the area thinking like a predator. Near water, but with cover. Those cattails would provide concealment while allowing it to monitor the pond for drinking animals. We approached cautiously, both aware of the danger a cornered python could pose. The morning was quiet, except for the occasional call of a mourning dove and the whisper of breeze through the cattails. "There," Jack pointed suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. At the edge of the cattails, partially submerged in the shallows, was the fourth python. It was massive like the others, but something about it seemed wrong. As we drew closer, I realized what I was seeing. The python wasn't hunting or hiding. It was injured, its body bearing deep lacerations that suggested it had been attacked by something with sharp hooves. "One of your cattle must have fought back," I said, approaching carefully. Jack frowned. "None of my herd has wounds that would match fighting something like this, and they're all accounted for." I knelt at a safe distance, assessing the python's condition. Its injuries were severe, multiple puncture wounds and what appeared to be broken ribs visible beneath its scales. Despite its massive size, it looked pitiful, its breathing labored and movements sluggish. "It's dying," I concluded grimly. "Those injuries are too severe." Jack stood beside me, his expression troubled. "Can't we help it like the others?" I shook my head. "Internal bleeding, probably. Beyond field treatment." As we watched, the python's head turned toward us, its dark eye fixing on me with what I could only describe as recognition. A chill ran through me as I realized this was another of the hatchlings I'd saved all those years ago. The distinctive pattern of scales along its side matched my memory perfectly. "I'm sorry," I whispered. The words meant for both the dying creature before me and for my sister, whose death had fueled my complicated relationship with these animals. The python's tongue flicked out one last time, tasting the air, tasting my scent. Then, with a shudder that rippled through its entire length, it grew still. Jack removed his hat, holding it respectfully over his heart. "Everything has its time," he said softly. "Even the creatures we fear." As we stood in somber silence, my phone rang, Ellie calling with an update. "We've stabilized Goliath for transport," she reported, "but there's something strange happening with the pythons. They seem agitated, all focused in the same direction." "Toward the west pond?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes." "How did you know?" "We found the fourth python. It's dead. Looks like it was attacked by something with hooves, but Jack says none of his cattle are injured." There was a pause on the line. "Mason," Ellie said carefully, "I think you should get back here. There's something you need to see." When we returned to the barn, we found Goliath loaded onto a specialized transport trailer, an IV drip attached to his neck, administering fluids and pain medication. The 3 pythons had been secured in separate wildlife transport containers, though they'd apparently resisted separation vigorously. Ellie met us at the entrance, her expression serious. "I've been examining the footage from last night more carefully," she said, holding up her tablet. "Look at this." She played a video from one of the surveillance cameras, showing the initial confrontation between Goliath and the first python near Sarah's oak tree. The timestamp indicated it was from before I'd arrived on scene. "Watch Goliath's movements," she instructed. "See how he approaches the python?" I studied the footage, noting how the bull had moved deliberately, almost stalking the massive snake. "It looks like he initiated the encounter," I said slowly. "But that doesn't make sense. Cattle avoid predators, they don't seek them out." "Exactly," Ellie nodded. "And there's more." She switched to another clip, this one showing Goliath charging the python, not in fear or defense, but in what appeared to be a calculated attack. The bull's massive horns had caught the python mid-body, explaining the injuries we'd observed when I first arrived. "Goliath attacked the python first," Jack said, disbelief coloring his voice. "But why?" "And there's this," Ellie continued, showing a third clip from later in the sequence. In this one, the python had managed to wrap around Goliath, beginning its constriction. But the bull wasn't struggling randomly. His movements were deliberate, leading the entwined predator directly toward the oak tree, a strategy evident from the very beginning of their encounter. "He planned it," I breathed, the realization staggering. Goliath deliberately engaged the python and led it to the tree as part of a strategy. It gets stranger. Ellie swiped to a final clip, this one from earlier yesterday morning before any of us had arrived. It showed Goliath approaching the stock pond where we'd just found the dead python. The bull had confronted the snake there as well, charging it with deadly precision and inflicting the fatal wounds we'd discovered. Goliath killed the fourth python, Jack said, his voice barely audible, and then went looking for the others. But instead of killing the one by the oak, he... What? Changed his mind? I struggled to make sense of the behavior. Ellie's scientific mind was clearly racing to process these observations. It's as if he was testing them. The one at the pond attacked aggressively, tried to strike his face. The one by the oak tree defended itself differently, maybe showed some quality that Goliath recognized. Recognized as what? Jack asked. None of us had an answer. The behavior defied conventional understanding of both bovine and reptilian psychology. A bull had systematically hunted down invasive predators on its territory, killed one that behaved aggressively but spared another, even forming some kind of alliance with it and its companions. There's one more thing, Ellie said hesitantly. When I was examining the pythons, I noticed they all have the same genetic markers. They're siblings, from the same clutch. I felt a chill run down my spine. The clutch I saved 20 years ago. She nodded. Based on their size and estimated age, it's possible. Which means I saved them, and now they've returned, I finished, the weight of this realization settling heavily on my shoulders. But how did they find each other after all these years? How did they know to come here? Jack had been silent, his gaze fixed on Goliath in the transport trailer. Now he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah's last words to me were about Goliath. She said, "He'll protect this land when I can't." I thought she was delirious from the medication, but now the implication hung in the air between us, that somehow Sarah had known, that Goliath's unusual behavior was connected to a promise or purpose beyond our understanding. Before we could discuss it further, one of the federal agents approached urgently. "Dr. Parker, the pythons are becoming extremely agitated. We need to move them now or sedate them further." Ellie hurried toward the transport containers, Jack and I following close behind. Inside each container, the pythons were indeed active, pressing against the sides facing the direction of the west pond. "They know," I said quietly. "They know their sibling is dead." Jack's weathered face softened with compassion. "They want to see it. To say goodbye." It was an outlandish suggestion. Attributing such complex emotions to reptiles went against everything I'd been taught about animal behavior. Yet after what we'd witnessed over the past 24 hours, who could say what these creatures were capable of understanding? "We can't delay Goliath's transport to the veterinary hospital," Ellie cautioned. "His condition is deteriorating." Jack looked torn, his gaze moving between the injured bull that had been his last connection to Sarah and the pythons that had formed such an unlikely bond with it. "Take Goliath," I decided. "I'll bring the pythons to the pond to see their sibling, then follow you to San Angelo." "Are you sure?" Ellie asked, concern evident in her voice. "Those pythons weigh over 200 pounds each. If they become aggressive—" "They won't," I said with a certainty I couldn't explain. "Not with me." As Goliath's transport prepared to depart, the massive bull struggled to rise despite his injuries and the sedation, his gaze fixed on the containers holding the pythons. One of the containers shook as its occupant pressed against the viewing panel, apparently trying to maintain visual contact with Goliath. "We need to move now," the veterinary technician urged, checking Goliath's vital signs. "His blood pressure is dropping." Jack climbed into the trailer, placing his hand on Goliath's massive head. "It's okay, big guy," he murmured. "I'll watch over them until you're back on your feet." Whether it was Jack's reassurance or simple exhaustion, Goliath finally settled, allowing the transport to depart for San Angelo. I watched it disappear down the driveway, carrying the bull that had challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world and about my own prejudices. With the help of 2 rangers, I loaded the python containers into a department truck and drove toward the West Pond. Jack followed in his pickup, his expression somber but determined. As we reached the pond, the reality of what I was about to do struck me with full force. I was willingly transporting 3 enormous pythons, members of a species I'd feared and hated since Elena's death, to pay respects to their fallen sibling. It was beyond unorthodox. It bordered on the surreal. Yet something deeper than professional duty or scientific curiosity drove me forward. Perhaps it was the need for closure, not just for these remarkable creatures, but for the wound I'd carried since that summer night 25 years ago when I'd held my dying sister in my arms. We positioned the containers near the body of the 4th python, still lying half-submerged at the pond's edge. With careful precision, I opened the first container, then stepped back, unsure what to expect. The python emerged slowly, its massive body flowing like water across the ground. It moved directly to its fallen sibling, its tongue flicking rapidly to confirm what it somehow already knew. The 2nd and 3rd pythons followed, each approaching the body with what could only be described as reverence. Jack and I watched in silence as the 3 living pythons arranged themselves around their dead sibling, their bodies forming a protective circle. They remained motionless for long minutes, as if in vigil. "They're mourning," Jack said softly, removing his hat once more. "Just like people do." I couldn't argue with his assessment. Whatever was happening before us transcended standard biological explanations. These pythons, creatures I'd spent a lifetime fearing, were displaying emotions I'd never thought them capable of experiencing. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the Texas landscape, I found myself thinking of Elena again. She'd loved all creatures, accepting their nature without fear or judgment. In her 16 years, she'd understood something that had taken me 25 years, and this extraordinary sequence of events to comprehend: that the lines we draw between species, between predator and prey, between enemy and friend, are far more permeable than we imagine. The largest python, the one with the distinctive scale pattern that matched my memory from 2 decades ago, finally turned from its sibling's body to face me directly. Its dark eyes held mine, and in that moment of connection, I felt a weight lifting, the burden of guilt and fear I'd carried since Elena's death. "I'm sorry," I whispered again, but this time the words were for my sister. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." As if in response, the python moved toward me, its massive body covering the ground between us with fluid grace. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but I held my ground, trusting in a connection I couldn't explain but somehow felt with absolute certainty. The python stopped just short of my feet, raising its head to my eye level. For a breathless moment, predator and protector regarded each other across an evolutionary gulf of millions of years. Then, in a gesture that would haunt my dreams for years to come, the python lowered its head in what appeared to be a deliberate nod before turning back to join its siblings in their vigil. Jack placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah would say some things don't need explaining. They just need accepting." As we stood together at the edge of the pond, watching these magnificent creatures mourn their lost sibling, I found myself agreeing with Sarah's wisdom. Some connections transcend understanding, between humans and animals, between predators and prey, between the living and those we've lost. And in that moment of acceptance, I felt Elena's presence more strongly than I had in 25 years, not as a painful memory, but as a gentle reminder that love and understanding can bridge even the widest divides. The pythons completed their vigil as the morning advanced, each touching the body of their fallen sibling one final time before turning toward us with unmistakable purpose. Whatever would happen next, we would face it together. An unlikely alliance forged in extraordinary circumstances, challenging the boundaries between species and rewriting what we thought we knew about the natural world. 1 month after the events at Whisper Creek Ranch, I stood on the newly constructed observation deck overlooking what locals had begun calling Goliath's Sanctuary. The summer heat had finally broken, giving way to the gentler warmth of early fall. Wildflowers dotted the rolling pasture, their colors vibrant against the recovering grassland. Below me, Goliath grazed peacefully near Sarah's oak tree, his white coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The massive Brahman bull had made a remarkable recovery after surgery at the San Angelo Veterinary Hospital. The broken ribs had been set, the deep lacerations sutured and healed with barely visible scars. Only a slight hitch in his gait remained as evidence of his ordeal. But it wasn't Goliath alone that drew visitors from across the country to this remote Texas ranch. It was his companions, 3 enormous Burmese pythons that had become inseparable from the bull since their return from various wildlife facilities 2 weeks ago. "Still can't believe what I'm seeing," Jack Harmon said, joining me at the railing. At 68, his weathered face had more lines than a month ago, but there was a lightness to him now, a sense of purpose that had been missing since Sarah's death. "How many visitors today?" I asked, nodding toward the small parking area where several cars displayed license plates from as far away as Maine and California. 27, Jack replied. "Not counting the university folks." He gestured toward a group of researchers setting up camera equipment near the far fence line. "That's Dr. Chen from Cornell, expert in animal cognition or some such. Says Goliath and the pythons might rewrite textbooks." I nodded, unsurprised. In the weeks following the confrontation with Rhodes, the unlikely bond between Goliath and the pythons had attracted attention from wildlife experts, behavioral scientists, and media outlets worldwide. What had begun as a local curiosity had blossomed into a phenomenon that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal behavior. The decision to create the sanctuary hadn't been simple. Department protocol called for invasive species like Burmese pythons to be removed from the wild, not protected. But the extraordinary circumstances and the python's clear connection to both Goliath and the land had demanded an equally extraordinary response. Governor Williams herself had intervened after viewing the footage of Goliath and the pythons working together to thwart Rhodes's men. The resulting compromise established a 40-acre sanctuary on Whisper Creek Ranch, complete with research facilities and controlled public access. The pythons would remain as permanent residents under careful monitoring, while scientists studied their unprecedented behavior. "How's Ellie's research coming along?" I asked, spotting the veterinarian among the scientific team below. Jack chuckled. "She's submitted her first paper already. Cross-species cooperative behavior in unlikely animal alliances, says it'll cause quite a stir when published." I had no doubt it would. Ellie Parker had transitioned from county veterinarian to lead researcher on what many were calling the most significant animal behavior discovery in decades. Her careful documentation of the interactions between Goliath and the pythons had revealed patterns that defied conventional understanding: deliberate communication, coordinated movements, even what appeared to be expressions of affection. "And your new foundation?" I inquired, referring to the Sarah Harmon Wildlife Understanding Project that Jack had established with funds from a documentary deal and private donations. Pride shone in Jack's eyes. "First scholarship goes out next month. Young woman from Houston studying reptile conservation. Reminds me a bit of Sarah. Same determination." Below us, the largest python, the one with the distinctive scale pattern that had first attacked Goliath, slithered from the shade of the oak tree to position itself alongside the grazing bull. Without breaking stride, Goliath adjusted his position slightly, accommodating his unlikely companion with practiced ease. The two moved in tandem across the pasture, maintaining physical contact as they had done consistently since their reunion. "Still don't have a proper name for that one," Jack mused, watching the pair. "The researchers keep calling it Python Alpha, but that doesn't seem right." "What would Sarah have called it?" I asked. Jack considered this, his gaze softening with memory. "Guardian, probably. She always did have a way of seeing the truth in things before anyone else." "Guardian it is, then," I agreed, finding the name fitting for the creature that had transformed from predator to protector in the space of a single remarkable day. My radio crackled with an incoming call from headquarters, reminding me that despite my involvement with the sanctuary, my duties as a ranger continued. The past month had brought significant changes to my professional life as well. Director Simmons had created a new position for me, Special Liaison for Wildlife Behavior Research, allowing me to split my time between traditional ranger duties and overseeing the sanctuary's development. More meaningful than the professional recognition, however, was the personal transformation I'd experienced. For 25 years, I'd carried the weight of Elena's death like a stone in my heart, channeling my grief into a controlled hostility toward the creatures I blamed for her loss. Now, watching these magnificent pythons coexist peacefully with Goliath, I felt a release from that burden, a healing I hadn't known I needed. "Victor Rhodes's trial date is set," I mentioned, changing the subject. "Federal prosecutors have evidence linking him to exotic animal trafficking operations in 3 states. Jack nodded grimly. "Good. Men like that see animals as commodities, not living beings. They don't understand the first thing about respect." Rhodes and his operation had been dismantled thoroughly in the weeks following his arrest. His former neighbor, Wyatt Daniels, had cooperated fully in exchange for leniency, providing evidence that implicated Rhodes in dozens of illegal wildlife transactions. The investigation had expanded to include corrupt officials who had shielded Rhodes's activities for years, sending shockwaves through Texas wildlife management circles. As we talked, I noticed movement from the research team below. They had gathered excitedly around their monitoring equipment, pointing and gesturing toward Goliath and Guardian. "Something's happening," I said, focusing my binoculars on the scene. What I saw took my breath away. Goliath had settled beneath the oak tree, and Guardian was performing a behavior never before documented in pythons. It was systematically applying pressure to specific points on the bull's injured side, almost like a therapeutic massage. The other 2 pythons had joined them, positioning themselves to provide shade from the afternoon sun. "They're treating his injury," Jack whispered in amazement. "Like they know exactly where he's hurting." The researchers were frantically recording the interaction, their expressions a mixture of scientific excitement and pure wonder. This was why they had come, to witness behaviors that challenged everything we thought we knew about animal cognition and interspecies relationships. "My daddy always said sometimes the good Lord puts angels in the strangest packages," Jack murmured, removing his hat as he watched the scene unfold. "Reckon he was right about that." I thought about those words as we observed the continued interaction between the bull and pythons. Angels in strange packages indeed, predators transformed into protectors, enemies into allies, fear into understanding. The boundaries we humans so carefully constructed between species seemed flimsy in the face of what was happening below us. "I've been thinking about Elena a lot lately," I admitted, surprising myself with the openness. I rarely spoke of my sister, even to those who knew her story. Jack waited patiently, giving me space to continue at my own pace. "She loved all creatures," I said finally. "Used to bring home injured snakes, turtles, anything she found. drove our parents crazy. I smiled at the memory. When she died, I blamed the snake, but I think I was really blaming myself for not being there sooner, for not saving her. Jack placed a weathered hand on my shoulder, the gesture conveying understanding without need for words. Watching Guardian and Goliath, I continued, I can't help but think Elena would have loved this. She would have understood it immediately, while the rest of us were still scratching our heads. Sarah would have too, Jack replied softly. Some folks just see clearer than others. Below us, the four animals had settled into a tableau of impossible harmony, Goliath resting against the trunk of Sarah's oak, the three pythons arranged around and over him in a protective formation that defied natural order, yet seemed, in this moment, the most natural thing in the world. Visitors watched from designated viewing areas, their expressions reflecting the same amazement I still felt, despite having witnessed this relationship develop over weeks. Children pointed and whispered questions to their parents, researchers documented every movement, and casual tourists snapped photos they would struggle to explain to friends back home. You know, Jack said thoughtfully, Sarah used to say that understanding sometimes comes after acceptance, not before it, that we spend too much time trying to explain mysteries instead of just experiencing them. As if in response to his words, Guardian raised its head, its dark gaze finding us on the observation deck with uncanny precision. After a moment, it lowered its head to rest once more against Goliath's flank, the bull rumbling a gentle greeting in response. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary as we continued our vigil, watching over these remarkable creatures that had changed not just our understanding of the natural world, but our understanding of ourselves. The oak tree that marked Sarah's final resting place seemed to embrace them all, bull and pythons, predator and prey, in its protective shadow. Later, as visitors departed and researchers packed away their equipment for the day, Jack and I made our final rounds of the sanctuary. The evening air carried the scent of wildflowers and distant rain, promising relief from the lingering summer heat. "Mason," Jack said as we approached the main gate, "I want to show you something." He led me to a small shed near the house, unlocking it to reveal what appeared to be a construction project in progress. A wooden sign, carefully carved but not yet painted. "Been working on this for the sanctuary entrance," he explained, running his hand over the smooth surface where he had etched a simple phrase, "In memory of Sarah Harmon and Elena Webb, who taught us to see with our hearts when our eyes failed us." Emotion tightened my throat as I read the words, recognizing the gift Jack was offering. Acknowledgement of Elena alongside Sarah, two women who had understood something profound about the connection between all living things. "It's perfect," I managed, gripping his shoulder in silent thanks. As we secured the sanctuary for the night, I took one final look at Goliath and his python guardians, now barely visible in the gathering dusk. The massive bull lay peacefully beneath Sarah's oak, surrounded by creatures that should have been his mortal enemies, but had instead become his most loyal protectors. In 40 years as a Texas Ranger, I'd seen plenty of strange things, but nothing had prepared me for what we'd discovered at Whisper Creek Ranch that scorching July morning. What began as a desperate struggle between predator and prey had transformed into something miraculous, a bond that transcended natural law and human understanding. As Jack had said, quoting his late wife's wisdom, "Some things don't need explaining, they just need accepting, and in that acceptance perhaps we find the greatest wisdom of all, that the boundaries between species, between friend and foe, between what we fear and what we love are far more permeable than we ever imagined." In the gentle Texas twilight, with Goliath and his pythons settling in for the night beneath Sarah's oak, that wisdom felt like the most natural thing in the world. Friends, Have you ever witnessed something that made you question everything you thought you knew? At Whisper Creek Ranch, we discovered that sometimes life's greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places. Like Jack Harmon, who found healing after losing his beloved Sarah through the extraordinary bond between his bull Goliath and three pythons, natural enemies who became protectors, or Ranger Mason, who carried the burden of his sister Elena's death for 25 years until these remarkable creatures helped him find peace. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds, to open our hearts to new understandings. As Jack's wife Sarah wisely said, "Some things don't need explaining, they just need accepting." Perhaps that's true of the challenges we face in our own lives, the losses, the changes, the unexpected turns. What unexpected friendship or event has changed how you see the world? Has there been a moment when accepting something difficult led to healing you never thought possible? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Remember, as the sign at Whisper Creek Sanctuary reads, sometimes we need to see with our hearts when our eyes fail us.